Hi, my name is Benedict. Forgive the less than perfect acoustics. I have to work in an open room, seeing it's high summer here in Ausland. What we're looking at here is Rev-T1. As the name sort of suggests, it's a reverb unit, and it's based around the concept of a reverb tank. So you will notice some tanky sounds. At times it will sound somewhat like a tin box. That's not its aim as such, but I don't hide from that. It's a character reverb. Broadly, I've called it an analog chamber. Chamber being a room that was built to pump sound into and record back out of. You can get a lot of variety of sounds. This, I will be quite upfront, is capable of sounding truly terrible, but it's also capable of having a really lovely character. A lot of that's going to come down to how well you understand how to use the unit and how well you match what the unit can do to what your source material is, and more importantly to what you're trying to make your source material say. If you're looking for just another formulaic perfect reverb, keep on walking. This one is a character reverb. It will work at any time for anyone, but it will reward best when you put some time and energy into it. It does not come with any presets. There's just the one. It's really about finding your own sound. So, everybody likes to hear drums, so we'll run through some drums first. Get that out of the way. Dry. Naturally, I'm in Cairns, so what I'm hearing is different from what you're hearing, but straight away we've got this really nice, wet, shiny room. If we want the room to be shinier, we can brighten it up. Now, I'm probably going to overdo reverb everywhere here. I'm trying to show off the unit. You would be a lot more tasteful, I hope, when you do your own things. Let's whack in the snare now. Listen to just the snare. Hear how that snare is really beefed up. We want to add a lot more. I won't really go into controls, but we've got the ability to put in early reflections. And the late. And balance the pair. So as you hear, it's put in a lot of character. Now if we look at some other... it's so weird working on one screen. If we put in some other types of things, let's go with bongos. Really dry. We get a lot of space around them. We want to push that being really close, we're going to push out early. We're going to have that sense of bigger space around us. Really nice. And acoustic guitar. For this we're going to want it to be a lot brighter. We might even focus a bit more on early reflections. Hear how that really brings out the zing in the strings. again, putting a lot of body in there. In reality, you may well want to go in with an EQ and control that body a little bit, but suddenly your sound starts to seem more real, even though this is quite a false sense of space, but it has character, and that's what's important. So enough of that. Alright, now I'll work all the way that I like to work. And I'll show you a lot of the options, and then we'll walk through exactly what this does, how it does it, and how you can get the most out of it. So very simple violin-y type synth sound, not meant to sound real. This does sound great on real strings, pianos, what have you. I've played around with it. So the first thing we'll do is we will add in our reverb unit. Remember, our source sound is just a single oscillator through a filter. What we're aiming for here is to give that sort of direct around the sound. Now you may well notice that it's a fairly mono reverb. Just about everything you encounter will be splashed right out onto the sides, and don't panic, we'll cover that in a moment. The whole idea of this is there is some stereo, and we'll cover what isn't later, but that in the real world, reverb often settles back into the center, and in terms of mixing, often that's what you really do want to do rather than constantly splashing everything out past the left and right. So deliberately, some stereo, quite a fair amount of mono. It's about embiggening a sound rather than in widening a sound. If we use this as a send, hear how it's now really wide and it's actually lusher, more lush. Not only because we've got more pronounced stereo, so the stereo that's built into this, and we've panned them left and right, but because we've now actually doubled the amount of reverberating that we've done. So we've actually doubled the number of taps in our algorithm, so we've made it a lot smoother. And if we put one single string sound into a reverb, which then goes to the bus, hear how characterful and glossy that sound becomes. Yes, it's become a little louder. I kind of like effects units that add a little bit of level. Otherwise, like things like the echo you put in your delay, you turn it on and suddenly your sound is half the volume. I find that a little distressing. Perfectly logical, but sometimes a little distressing. So before we run through the knobs and buttons, actually a few more things I was going to show you. If we fill out our sound, so we've got a very simple sound. If we double our oscillators, we add a chorus and delay, naturally it's a little less obvious because we've already got quite a lot of things happening in there, and then again we can go out to, if we do the whole multi-oscillator thing, dry, local, send. So we can get some really lovely feel. With what's essentially what people would say was a terrible reverb. It's how we use them that's going to make a big difference. We haven't even gotten into EQing. So let's kill that fella just for the moment. Keep it send. Now let's just go back to our basic sound because it's easier to hear. Turn that off, turn that off, turn that off. Now to wire these to turn them into a stereo reverb, you can either do this within, depends on how you do it, it's within your DAW. I'm just showing it in Reason because it's very easy to see. But any DAW that allows you to be a bit modular or control who does what will let you do this. You can either do it inside a combinator underneath your device if you wanted that, but for me I would only do this on the send because that's me. So we'll use one send, one goes to one version of the device, one goes to the other version of the device. You're going to want them to have the same essential patch. In Reason, if you're not familiar, you can always copy and paste the patch. So that way you know they're the same. You make what you want on one, and then you can add your second one in. You'll see that I've then taken mono out, mono out. If you take the right out, then you'll find that there's no signal there. Not because the device is mono, it is stereo when it's used in this way, but when you feed it mono, it will only come out the same side. Don't quite know why, just how it works. If you plug into the right only, it won't give you a signal. So you can either send those straight back to your return, which is up here, or in this case, you can send them to something else. Now that could be a whole string of devices which are just going to affect the reverb signal alone. So we could bring in an EQ and really change the feel of that reverb. But I'm sure I don't need to tell you how to EQ, at least not in this. In this case, I've chosen my little Huss tank. If these patches were exactly the same, then we could either open up the second one and make some little alterations. We only want to make little alterations, otherwise our left and right are not going to relate to each other. So it'd be like having a tiny little tin box here and having a massive hall on the other side, and it's going to sound kooky, unless you've got a really good plan. So essentially, same or similar. If they're exactly the same, then you can use this fella and just put a tiny bit of delay. I'm overdoing it. But you can put a tiny bit of delay. That tiny bit of delay means that if all our taps on, in this case, the left-hand side are lined up like this, and we then delay the right-hand side a little bit, we've now got our taps in between those on the left-hand side. So you've doubled the number of taps and where they're happening, and they will be happening like this. And just as my fingers get blurry when I do this in the camera, so will your sound. So it gives you a lot of control. The other reason I chose this little fella wasn't just to show off, but because it has a function that I find extremely useful. I talked about stereo and too much stereo before. We can narrow that down if we want. While it sounds wonderful when you're just playing a solo sound to have your stereo out here, you feel like, oh, in a mix, that can become problematic. Not always, depends on your mix, but be careful. If you're struggling to get bigness in your mix, it's probably because everything's too big. You've got no contrast. If you've got no little sounds, you've got no big sounds. You can make your sounds bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, but because you've got no little sounds. If you want wide sounds, you need narrow sounds, so that the user can hear the difference between, ooh, that one's small, that one's big. So it can be worth narrowing that down a little bit. Your business, how you do it. You can even get into freaking people out and putting phase reversal on. Naturally, just check your collapse. If you do that, but more often than not, it is going to work. So just showing you, if you're thinking, oh, but geez, that reverb is too mono-y to start with, it's going to pan really, really nicely. If we look here, so local reverb is on. Hang on, better open my fader so I can find my pan. If you narrow down your stereo width, if I pan this fully to one side, you'll see a problem. That's not like the real world. If somebody comes and talks to you into your left ear, you've got some sound bouncing back from the right-hand side of the room into your ear. So this is why you might consider, rather than having a perfect stereo image, you're still going to feel natural. Entirely up to you, but if you use really perfect, true stereo reverbs, you can end up with a very strange sounding mix. Because, as I say, the information is not coming back from the other side, so it sounds like that's fallen off the edge of the world. Quite kooky. So, just a couple of different things that you can do. Let's whack that back in the center and close that up. Now we're going to turn off the sends for now, so they're not in the game. We're just going to have this fella here and walk through what it does, what each knob and the one button does. As it says, it's an analog chamber, so we're creating a tank in which we inject sound, do stuff to it whilst it's in there, and then suck it back out the other end. This is a pretty important thing to understand. If you can understand the concept of a room, if we were to build a room and put things inside that room, little repeaters, things to make this sound keep coming back, then that's what the inside of this would look like. Metaphorically, of course. In reality, it's ones and zeros. So, we input, we can control the early and late size. Reverbs are commonly made of the first things that bounce back to us are what we call early reflections, obviously because they've reflected off the wall first, and then we've got late. So the early reflection tends to be the very first bounce, hits the wall, comes straight back to my ears. They're fairly discernible. Then when that thing that's bounced off the wall goes past my ears, bounces off the wall behind me and comes back to my ear, that's a late reflection, because it has become quite modified from me to there, back there, to here. So the late reverb will tend to be more than the first, which will be ping. I hope that makes sense. We have the ability to extend our time, make it twice the length. So are we looking for a smallish chamber or a big place? Dry to early. We've got our dry signal coming in, which is, let's just turn that down. That. Our early. Now our late. So this is telling the system whether the late reflections are being driven more by a pure dry signal. In other words, we're taking the dry signal and feeding it into this bit. Or are we taking the results of the early reflections and feeding them into this bit? We can choose how that balances out. So our lates will be fairly thin. Actually, I'll just shorten that release a bit just to make it slightly easier. So as you hear, there's quite a difference. Naturally, by using the early reflections into your late reflections, it will tend to be louder. Something about this, I have made no attempt to try to make everything you do even levels for everything else. Because the problem is you start making compromises, and because there are so many injection points here, there's no way you can realistically level it without making decisions that somebody might not want later. So if we are taking a dry into our lates, it's that much level. If we're taking our earlies into our lates, then it actually, I think it doubles in level. In which case, just be aware of that. So as you see, we're getting really quite a nice sound already just from doing that. So you will probably most of the time want to balance your early reflections into your lates. There's no real reason that you wouldn't, but if you're wanting a thinner, more subtle reverb, then you may well want to suck in only dries. We can double the length of our late. Now that is the same as pressing this and that. So it quite literally just adds more time on. It allows you to have more sensitivity in your knob. If you go, yeah, okay, I'm out here, but it's not quite as long as I want it, that'll be overkill probably. So now your tiny, short sounds can start to whine. You do have modulation, which will help control that some, but it will whine. So did most of the reverb units used by Kraftwerk, by Mort Garson, all these early guys. Most of the reverb units that they were using did whine. It's not a bad thing, make a feature of it. Or, if it really bothers you, just create a notch in an EQ and take it out. So we can create really quite tiny spaces. As long as we watch our decays, the whine is going to be negligible. Modulation. Yes, as you see, we have modulation here. It can go from incredibly slow to fast. Now, what is modulated? The modulation amount is sent early. There are actually 2 delays inside there, and there are 2 LFOs inside here. One LFO is sent to the left early, one is sent to the right early. We can get a reminder that this is actually stereo at the outputs by seeing that it's got a little stereo symbol, as we see here, and then these are mono to remind us that they are mono. So the modulations also go between the 2 LFOs. They go to each of these in inverted and different amounts. So you get interesting results. It's constantly always kind of moving in a slightly complex way. If you want to get into doing spring type things, and this is not a spring emulator as such, but you can go some way there. you've got a fair amount of variety as to what you can do with it. Tone. They are pure and simply synth cutoff filters. So we've got the ability to roll off our highs. You saw with the guitar struminations that if we open that right up, it becomes very bright and can be really charming on things, or just and the low obviously does the opposite, so it passes only what's above it. Really bright red. They will do for a lot of things, but you're probably going to want to apply an EQ to this with a reasonable amount of sophistication. Within reason, the M class is going to do the job. You can use whatever EQ you want. In this situation, if I was to simply apply the EQ equalizer meter here, that would be EQing the whole signal. So it would be EQing my violin as well as my reverb. So just obviously do your thinking as to what's being EQ'd. If I put my EQ in here, making sure my routing's correct, then I'd be EQing just the signal. But you can do either. You can put this into a combinator and then separate your original and your affected signal, just EQ your affected signal. I'll leave you to know how to do that. I can maybe make something later, but it strikes me as overkill because chances are you know how to do it. So, tone controls. Now, late. Remember, we've got an early section, which up full is going to sound like a kind of chorus. So it's a simple, you could think of it as almost being a simple bucket brigade style chorus, a simple ensemble type thing, which is either going to be really wonderful or actually make you sound weird. So use with care. It can just be too much. So a lot of times you're going to want it fairly far down in the mix and focus on your lates. So remember, the lates can be fed pure dry signal, in which case once it hits here, everything is from the dry signal, or it can be fed any combination of what's happened at the early reflections. It will give you a fatter sound. Play with it. We have got 4 taps here. So this is 4 points at which the signal is echoed again. It's just delay lines. It's an algorithm. So we've got a pair here. We feed into a second pair. Now this pair are actually receiving what's happened here in mono. So the stereo sends to here, but when it sends to here, it's sent in mono. Everything that's sent past this is also sent in mono. It's very deliberate. I thought about making it full stereo, but it not only is going to use a lot more CPU, but as I've shown you, you've got a lot more control if you want to create your own stereo reverb to do it within your DAW than to load this down with extra functions which you're probably not going to use. So if we're at your instrument, you rarely really want to mix an instrument in full stereo. You're probably going to narrow it down, in which case the narrower reverb is probably going to help you. When you pan your instrument off, that reverb's going to go with it, as would normally be the case. So, this is actually a pair. Number 1 is a pair. The signal comes in, and it's in mono, and it's fed to 2 delays. They're quite close to each other, closer actually than your 2 earlies, and they're hard panned left and right. They go to the late out in stereo, but when you have the option to pass them to number 4, that goes in mono. The signal from wherever you've brought it here, whichever mix you've brought here, is also equally sent to taps 2, 3 and 4. Tap 1 is not feeding 2 or 3, but it can be made to feed 4. I have found that if you make taps 1 feed 2, 3 and 4, you can just end up with an awful mess. There would be a way to balance it and make it lovely, but it didn't seem necessary bearing in mind it's more likely to make a mess and make the unit harder to use. Each of these has time. The overall amount of time is controlled by the late size knob. So that's the master length of your echo for all of these. So if this is really short, these are all really short. If this is really long, they're all really long. Same with this button, it affects them. So you could think of starting with all of these in the perfect upright position and then saying, okay, I'm just going to offset them somehow. So this means you would hear number 1 first, number 2 second, number 3, number 4 last. There is nothing to stop you. We'll make that bigger just to make it easier to hear. There's nothing to stop you from doing this. You can arrange these however you like, which will be how you end up making your own reverb space, and that's really important. We can, as I said, feed the output of tap 1 into tap 4. Now that's the output pre-level control, so when you change this, it's not going to change this relationship. Listen to the end. So hopefully you notice that not only does it become longer, but it becomes smoother on the end. So there's a little bit of bloom in the sense that when 1 hits 4, it will up a little bit. But that's all up to how you choose to manage and create your room. The more you can visualize the concept of how you're making rooms and what they look like, how they behave, the easier this will be for you. So especially in the situation, if we're looking for a relatively short, and we don't want that tail to be too long, we can go to mostly a dry input. If we want to enhance that tail a little bit, we can send to late. Generally, you're going to want a balance of both. Oh, something you may have noticed is all of these controls are live. The Reverb algorithm, unlike many things like Rev's, like RV7000, that will turn itself off whilst changes are being made. This will not. So, very breakable. We've got level controls. Each of these taps has a level control. It can go right down to nothing. So now we're hearing only tap 1. We can mix in some early. And it works. We can bring in tap 2. Actually, let's get rid of tap 1. So that's our range. We can have up to quite a large range. You probably don't want to put all these knobs in exactly the same spot. Close to each other will give you a thicker sound, but there's nothing to stop you from creating more of a multi-tap delay feel. Deliberately no padding on these. You want them to stay down the middle so they're nice and natural. But probably what we're going to want to do is to say, because in our situation here, I'll get rid of the early. As you can hear, that's quite a long delay, but as you can hear, our reverb is essentially a block. can extend that with our decay, which is assigning feedback to all of these. Obviously our taps are far too far apart from each other. So it's a block. There's a reverb and then it chops off. It kind of gates. It's not a gate, but if you want to do that, that's exactly how you're going to do it in this case. You're going to set your reverb time and kind of a gated reverb. Easy peasy. If you put it in decay, that will work, but you can now shape your room. So we could say, I want this to be a loud reverb to start with, and then I want each tap after that to decay, which is exactly what's going to happen in the real world. My first bounce is going to be pretty loud. By the time it's gone to the back wall and come back, it's lost some of its level. Hear how that, rather than sounding like a block of reverb, now has a shape to it, an envelope shape to it. But wait, there's more. There is absolutely nothing to stop you from doing this to it. Let's go there, there, there. Somebody got quite famous using that for their drum sound. He used to have a name, but his purpleness got too much for him. But that is essentially creating a backwards envelope on our reverb. So our taps go backwards in volume. If we put a decay in there, as in we up our feedback, this is now what's called a bloom reverb. Bloom reverbs are gorgeous. People don't use them enough. So with a percussive sound, you're going to hear your sound, but without having to use some kind of pre-delay for your reverb to move your whole reverb back. It and then falls off. So really nice effect. We can darken our room. So you can hear how that comes up after the sound. And you've got as much control as you need here. What we might do is say, okay, I'm going to put that really late in the mix so that I have, rather than stereo at the beginning going to mono, that I've got mono at the beginning and it will expand as we go. We could then start small, get large, get less large, let's make that louder just so it's easier to hear. Can you hear how the stereo opens up? It doesn't go outside the edges of the world, but it just broadens a little bit as it goes back. So it gives us quite a different feel from having our stereo up here. That puts the beginning of the reverb quite close to us. If we pull it out here, it's pulled a lot of that reverb quite a long way back into our room. So if we want our sound to seem really, and for such a bright sound, it's not quite the right way to go. But if we wanted our sound to be hear how that adds a kind of melancholy compared to this. That's forward, the other way round is back, so it moves us back in space and time. A little too much modulation maybe. So that's how this works. The decay, as I said, is just a feedback. You can make it howl. It's not my suggestion, but there are situations in which it can be very cool to make it do that. Make sure you have a limiter. It won't go too out of control, but it will do that. Obviously, the higher your feedback or decay setting here is, the more likely you are to introduce whining. You can try adding a little bit of modulation here, but you won't get rid of everything all the time. That is the nature of it, part of why it's actually called a chamber or a tank, because that's what this fella is. Really nice little reverb. We can feed that again into our very, very flexible in what you can do with it, because rather than using a pre-built algorithm that you can't do a lot with, you're actually setting up the algorithm to a great extent from the word go, because you've got your early reflections being quite independent from your lates, and then you can control your times of your lates in absolutely any way you want. You can do this if you wanted. Whether it's a good plan, I don't know. So we are getting to have quite a nice sound. Needs to be low in the mix. So early, we can get rid of either the early or lates completely. And so they're completely independently mixable. You can use just your earlies. Now your early does not go through the tone controls. I debated on it, decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to let our earlies be always really bright. Or we can go all late. We've got completely independent wet and dry controls. So we can have 100% wet, which is exactly what we're doing here. In the send situation, turn off the dry, all wet. As I said, this will tend to make your sounds louder. You can control that here. So if level matching is important, that is built in that you can level match. That basically covers all its use. So really, if you get this as part of the James 4 pack, spend some time really playing with it. Don't think that this is meant to be just another reverb unit where you take up presets and that instantly gives you what you think you're getting. No. This is a real DIY proposition where you get in there and create your own sound. And the more you understand about how the device works and how creating sound spaces, literally creating the illusion of space and feeling around your work. Remember how when we threw this back to the end, we ended up with a more down, melancholy kind of feel than where we have it forward in the front. So we can really change how we feel. The more you understand that, the more you'll get from the device. When you're starting out, probably keep your earlies low, especially when dealing with real instruments, because the chorusy side of that can tend to make them sound plasticky and weird. Use this as a feature, please go for it. But just to make it a little easier to start with, keep your earlies fairly low. They're still worth having in because they bring an immediacy and a sheen to the core sound that naturally your lates can lose. Because when we're listening to our lates here, not a lot of shine or immediacy on that, plenty on that. So all about balance. Well, if you've got any questions, video, ask them down below. More than happy to help you understand this beastie, because there's a lot it can do, and as such, initially it can confuse you, but understand that the solution doesn't lie in presets, because the presets won't work for you, as they never work, really. But to understand the nature of the sound, more importantly the nature of the story you want that sound to tell, and then to build your sound here, which will be totally unique for you and that sound, so that everything is really telling the same story. Have fun.